Well, while we're waiting for the PowerPoint to appear behind me, I guess I could just recap what I'll be talking about today. Most of you already know that I've been the lead developer of Ride in the last year or so. Optima got the mission of taking care of the further development of Ride. And after Nick Nikolov left last year, we've carried on the development. And earlier this year, together with version 17 of Dyalog, we released version 4.1, which is our second release of this new brand of Ride. I can't seem to recall my slides. But essentially, we had a few items on with the release of 4.0 that upset people. And Jay mentioned earlier today that the most missed feature was the floating windows. So the first task we tackled was to find a way to reintroduce the floating windows in Ride. A second thing that came up pretty quickly was the responsiveness of the editor when having large scripts. And our benchmark has always been the sharplot script that I think reaches above 20,000 lines somewhat, with quite dense lines of APL. So we used that as a benchmark and realized quickly that there wasn't much we could do with the existing editor that we had, CodeMirror. And there we go, finally. So now you can see my name as well. Me, Gilgamesh Athoraya. I'll be talking today. Right, so I mentioned that Optima has been tasked with the development of Ride. In the end of last year, we had to say goodbye to our colleague Callum Flume, who, before he left, set the path for 4.1. So he introduced this move to ECMAScript 6, which has a lot of welcome features in it, makes the code easier. And he's pushed a change in code style as well to make it easier to collaborate on code, because the code style we had in Ride previous to that was a little bit harder to collaborate on and harder to get introduce new members to. So we've converted most of the code base to a little bit spacious and more verbose, perhaps, code style. It's based on the Airbnb style guide. And another thing that Callum started out was the evaluation of a new editor, so the Monaco editor to replace the old CodeMirror editor. And also reworked or refactored the style sheets for Ride in general. Right, so rehearsing this again. So most of the priorities for 4.0 were ticked off, and as we can see, the main items there I've already said: floating windows, zero footprint operation was almost there, but we had a little bit of work to do to tidy it up. In general, improving the user experience, small glitches that, when you're tracing or coding, it was misbehaving a little bit, and we just made sure to go through all of that and make sure that the experience overall was improved. Right. About floating windows, well, this, I guess it says itself what floating windows mean, but some people prefer the term undocked windows. So rather than forcing all of your Ride windows within one main application window, you can have separate editor windows or preference windows that you move across from one screen to another. And apart from the editors themselves, we've tried to make that work for other windows that appear. So warning messages, preferences, about window, the general dialog windows that pop up should all be undocked. And just to see what that looks like a little bit, in 4.1 you can now edit multiple functions and have them appear in separate browser windows. Now, it's a little bit expensive loading separate windows, and we've kept the option of having a separate editor window that houses all the individual function windows. So you get this combination of docked, undocked, a separate editor window, which is undocked from the main application window, but still have tabs of individual editor windows within that. That improves the responsiveness mainly and gives you the flexibility of moving editor window to a separate display. Right, I mentioned the preferences. One of the main hurdles in 4.0 was that if you open the preference windows, you couldn't actually see much of your ride window because it covered all of it. And by making it undocked, you can again change the settings and try them out in the session while you're playing around with that. So it's quite nice. Now, RIDE is using the Electron framework, and part of the main reason of using the Electron framework is to make it cross-platform. And when writing cross-platform applications, there's this balance of trying to find a native look and feel for dialog windows and similar, but still allow the flexibility of running your application on multiple platforms. So with RIDE 4.1, we've tried to make use of whatever native functionality exists. So on Windows, for example, this dialog message is a native Windows dialog message. And on the other platforms, it looks slightly different. Zero footprint operation is something that Morten demonstrated earlier today. So being able to launch or connect to a running interpreter without actually installing RIDE or the interpreter on the local machine, which I think the example we saw earlier essentially ticks the box for the use case for that. We don't expect people to use the zero footprint version to develop locally, but gives you a way of developing or debugging an interpreter that you don't have direct access to. It's not on your local machine. I think we've achieved our goal of making it work well and look and feel the same as the standalone desktop version of RIDE. And there's an example of what that looks like, but you've seen it in action before. So, right, I've mentioned the slow response in large script files. Apart from that, we've reviewed all the styling of the application to make it a little bit more consistent, use the APL font where appropriate, and a non-APL font where it's not required, strictly required, so it just feels a little bit cleaner. And we've introduced the concept of having two color themes. As you probably see in most applications today, you've got a dark and a light theme, and having the option to change that has been introduced. The Monaco editor that we use is a Microsoft module that was developed for their new editor, VsCode. And all the features that you find in RIDE's new editor are basically features that are available in the VsCode editor. So if you've seen the VsCode editor or you're familiar with it, you'll know that there are lots of features that, well, they're documented on the VsCode site, and it makes the editing experience in RIDE very different to the native one. An example is having multiple cursors to edit your code, for example. Right, so here's just a quick demo of some of the features. You've got snippet completion for control structures, And let's see, there's the autocomplete, backtick complete to type is things that were existing in Write 4 already. Moving lines, this is, I'm not sure we had that in 4. This is a new feature, I believe. Right. Dark and light theme, I've mentioned. You can customize the themes as you could before, but the dark chrome and light chrome is fixed. So you can't change the colors of that, but you can pick one as a basis for your syntax colors. Right, we've focused a lot on stability, making sure that the small glitches and bugs have been fixed. And in the last year, about 200 issues have been closed. And when I looked today, I saw that the 102 issues, 42 of them are enhancement requests. So there aren't that many, there are less bugs than we used to have. And I think the experience in general, from what I heard from users, is that they're quite happy with the way it works today. Right, next generation integration. I'll be talking briefly about something that we've started looking at recently, which is rather than using Ride as your main development tools, how could we bring APL closer to other development tools and IDEs? There's a lot of hardcore programmers that like VI, Emacs, and the like. I've just recently, actually with the development of Ride, familiarized myself with VsCode, and I like that environment. And Microsoft has been pushing hard to promote their own products, of course, but they've introduced a few protocols that aim to make it easier to collaborate between tool developers and language implementers. And in their editor, VsCode, for example, they allow people to contribute and develop extensions to make the user experience better for a specific programming language. And there are three ways of contributing to VsCode. The first one is a language configuration, which is contributing a grammar to do syntax highlighting, for example. Snippets and file association, just simply associating an extension with a specific programming language, or by scanning the content of a document and picking up, using regular expressions, identifying which language it contains. So as a first stab at contributing to VsCode, I've developed a simple language configuration to do exactly that. So borrowing from the GitHub syntax grammar that was developed by, what's his name, John Gardner, I've converted the grammar to fit in with the VsCode contribution. And we now have APL syntax highlighting and recognition of APL words. If you have the APL font installed, it will automatically switch to the APL 385 font when you open an APL file in VsCode. The second way of contributing a language to VsCode is by implementing something called a language server. And the language server implements the language server protocol devised by Microsoft. The idea with this protocol is that each tool implements a client for this protocol that presents the server with events like the user has just opened this document. Can you provide some diagnostics for it? Can you provide a hover completion for a hover or autocomplete for this particular file at this particular position? And it allows the language implementers to implement a server that provides these features to any given tool. The idea being that you can have a many-to-many relationship between IDEs and languages. So in theory, we'd only need to implement the language server once for APL, and then you could consume the services and features from any of the tools that implement the client. So Eclipse, IntelliJ, VsCode, Vim, Cocoon, Sublime Text 3 are editors that already have language clients implemented. There will be some work to configure them to connect to an APL language server. But apart from that, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, essentially. And a couple of other examples, Atom and Emacs, that have some work in progress to implement their own clients. Right, I've mentioned some of the features before, but as we don't have, APL isn't a typed language, there are limited things that we could provide to tools. So hover and tooltips, folding rules, autocomplete to some extent, diagnostics. Go to definition of implement a class or an interface, for example, we could do. Offer things like refactoring the code, which we already do in the Windows IDE. We could provide that as a service through a language server. Then there are things that might be more difficult to do, but may be relevant to APL houses that have their typed APL with metadata in functions to describe the signature of a function, for example. The idea is that we could allow individual APL houses to extend a language server and implement their own callbacks to provide features like signature help when you call a function to know what arguments it takes, etc. The other side of this is a debug adapter. So how do you trace and debug your application? Microsoft has developed a protocol for that as well, that they're hoping that tool implementers will adopt. And the idea, again, is to try to generalize it as much as possible, because languages are very different in how they allow tracing and debugging. They've come up with this protocol that is allowing you to set breakpoints and step through code, and the implementers can then write an adapter to translate between this generalized protocol into a debugger-specific protocol. So in our case, with Dyalog, we would translate between DAP and RIDE, or alternatively, if Dyalog implements the DAP protocol directly, then any of those tools that I mentioned before, in theory, could connect to a Dyalog interpreter and trace through and debug an application with their own user interface for debugging. Right, finally, in VsCode, they want to offer everything to the developer, so there's even an integrated terminal where you can run some statements and try out your code, and many languages have implemented their own REPL in this integrated terminal. I think it's something that we could potentially do with Dyalog as well, but we'd need to explore the limitations of that and how useful it would be to us APL developers. I should mention that a couple of extensions have already been published to the VsCode extension marketplace, but it's very much in early stages of exploring the feature set, so it's not something that we promote and want to be used commercially, as it were. But feel free to explore, try it out, and see if it gives you any value. I think the APL language extension that provides the syntax highlighting could certainly be installed without too much problems. Right. Now, let's see, how am I doing with time? 4 minutes? 12? 10? Okay. I guess a little bit of time. Let me see if I can demonstrate some of this. So let's see. I'll start up Visual Studio Code just to do a quick intro of that. Yeah. I thought so. There we go. Right. You can see that. So first of all, for those that are not familiar with VsCode, there's this button here on the left for the extensions marketplace. If you want to install an extension, you click on that and then search for. Oh right, I'm not online. And if you have access to internet, if you search on APL, you'll see two extensions listed. APL language, which is this extension that provides the syntax highlighting. And then we have, and then we have the language server client, which is trying to implement all the other features, and that's still under development. So all the hovering and prefix completion, etc., etc. Feel free to install this one. APL language server client, you may wait. Right, the integrated terminal is here in the bottom, and just to show you what that looks like, if you navigate to a function and a file that contains some APL code, you can launch the command palette in VsCode, which lets you execute some commands. And as an extension developer, you can contribute commands. And I've contributed a simple command there that launches the Dyalog interpreter here in my integrated terminal. So what we see here is an error message apart from other things, but we see that we have now access to a TTY version of this session of Dyalog, and we can execute commands. We can see what's in this workspace here. I can see there's a namespace called myAPM with the function foo, and I will try to call that with a couple of arguments. And it's there. It's working. And just to show some magic here, I change that function, and then I issue my open project command to refresh it. And if we then try to execute this again, we get 15. Right, so the dialog session there is fixing the code that it finds in the current directory and makes it available to you immediately in the session, which means that in theory you can start developing in VsCode directly and test your expressions without launching a separate interpreter. Right? And that was an example of autocomplete and hover features. Well, those of you that have used RIDE will find a lot of this very familiar. I mean, there are the command palette, for example, is something that is exposed, although not promoted in RIDE. So, I mean, there are features there that you'll find in RIDE as well. And it seems only natural to start looking at what we can achieve with VsCode. It's a very popular editor today, even if Notepad++ might still be winning in that race, I'm not sure. That's all I wanted to show today. Any questions? Oh, well, thank you.